All right, let's talk about the plot to kill the Pope. Hello and welcome back to the Champagne Anarchism read-through of Manufacturing Consent, Herman and Chomsky's masterpiece. We are on chapter 4 today, and that means that we are talking about the plot to kill the Pope. And the actual title of this chapter is the KGB Bulgarian Plot to kill the Pope. This chapter is all about the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. So we're going to get into it, but before we do that, I just want to start out by saying thank you to everybody. And if you've made it this far in this book, I know this book can be a little bit of a struggle sometimes, but this is a incredibly worthwhile book. So I appreciate everybody who's giving consistent feedback on social media and here and just on these videos and really engaging with this stuff. It's really cool to see that. If you want all of this together totally for free for all this main feed stuff, you can head to the Patreon. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism to sign up over there and just kind of join the chat. But if you've made it this far in Manufacturing Consent, we only have 2 more chapters to go. It is really, really cool, and you should definitely be extremely proud of yourself. And yeah, congratulations. This is not an easy one to get through. We are going to dig into this chapter. This is likely to be a pretty short video because there's really not all that much to say. What is interesting is how something is invented by the media, something that supports the dominant narrative coming from elites back in the United States in this case, and then the government or elites will sort of put their shoulder to it and get behind this more or less. Although we'll see this is a very interesting case in this chapter particularly. And then the media will just absolutely run wild with it. So let's dig right in. We are talking today about the 1981 shooting of the Pope, non-fatal, but this is an assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II by Mehmet Ali Shah. Again, 1981, he wounded the Pope in St. Peter's Square just as the Pope was entering. So obviously, this is a huge story. You have to report on this story. We talked in previous videos about the way the media works, how some stories are brought to the front, how some stories are suppressed. But this is a story that you cannot ignore. But what do you do if it doesn't necessarily fit into any of the dominant media narratives that you've been building over the course of the Cold War? Well, you could just make something up. And that, by the way, is exactly what they did. So the basic concept here is that the media, in this case, completely manufactured a possible Soviet connection between Shah and the Soviet Union at the time. One of the things that's interesting about this case that the authors of this book note is that most of the time they're talking about the media propagating a government narrative. But in this case, the narrative didn't really come from the government. All of this is invented by the media itself. Now, the government obviously got behind it completely, but the media in this case is the one in the driver's seat for this entire story, really pushing this narrative. And there were 3 journalists in particular that were quite involved. We'll get to them in just a second. But this is really a story and a chapter about how this media narrative goes so far because it supports the government propaganda machine. And we should say right from the outset that for this Bulgarian connection that they're trying to manufacture between Shah, the Soviet Union, and Bulgaria as the go-between, there was 0 evidence for this claim at the time. So all of this is just a kind of fascinating case study in how a conspiracy theory can be taken up and pushed in the service of a government narrative. So let's just dig right in. Herman and Chomsky set out what they call the Sterling Henze Kalb model, which is based on the names of these 3 journalists that became extremely prominent in pushing this narrative and made huge names for themselves and a lot of money off of it. That's Claire Sterling, Paul Henze, and Marvin Kalb. And each of these people in their own way played central roles in kind of shaping this narrative around the alleged Soviet KGB involvement in this assassination attempt. Now, this starts when Reader's Digest, which used to be a huge deal, but now, I mean, kind of barely exists beyond dentist offices. But back then, Reader's Digest was a huge deal, and they hired Paul Henze and Claire Sterling, 2 journalists who were going to go and investigate this connection. And we should note as well that Paul Henze was a former CIA operative, so very much in the system, and also very much the expert that you might push into a situation like this. Later on NBC, Marvin Kalb was the one who narrated the special, and they provided the groundwork for what they called the Bulgarian connection. So what was the Bulgarian connection? Well, the idea was that Asha, the assassin, was in Bulgaria for a time. And during that time, obviously, he must have forged a connection with the KGB. The KGB, at this point, were really interested in discrediting Turkey and undermining NATO. At least this is the dominant theory. So if Turkey can be discredited, and Asha, we should mention, was a Turkish national. If Turkey can be discredited, then the Sterling Henze Kalb model said the KGB would be interested. And so they set this guy up. They picked this Turkish guy and showed that Turkey couldn't be trusted by having him go and assassinate the Pope. And if that sounds a little insane and maybe a bit from a spy novel, listen, a lot of weird stuff happened during the Cold War. It just so happens that this was absolutely not true, or at least not true as far as we know. The proof that they relied on initially was a little different, but eventually they fell around this proof that they came to, which was a confession that Asha gave to Italian police, which came after his confinement of 17 months at the hands of a very different Italy from the one that we know now. Even now, you probably don't really want to spend time in an Italian prison, but back then, really, really not. So was this confession forced? Probably. Or, I mean, let's say possibly. But either way, hanging your entire case off a connection that could so obviously be forced is sort of a major problem if you're a journalist going into this. So Asha stayed in Bulgaria, according to his confession. Asha stayed in Bulgaria during the summer of 1980. And then he had some links to an organization called the Grey Wolves. The Grey Wolves were a Turkish ultra-nationalist group, and they did have some links with the Soviet Union. And so this could have possibly been a thing. They certainly did business in Bulgaria. But this very tenuous proof rested on this idea, just this deep-baked ideological assumption that Herman and Chomsky tell us is, well, this is just sort of the thing that Soviets do. We kind of talked about this, right? This sounds like it's out of a spy novel. If you're living and existing in the context of the Cold War, something that I personally missed, but if you're living and existing in this context, it is just a climate where you will be primed to think, yes, this insane thing, that's just something that Soviets do. That's just how the Soviet Union operates, right? In the shadows, very secretive. Of course, they could go to Bulgaria, to this obscure organization, Turkish organization, to tentatively undermine Turkey in NATO, and they picked this guy who clearly has some major mental issues. And by the way, all of this rests on a confession that may or may not have been extracted after 17 months in Italian prison. I mean, this is a problem. But you can see why it might make some sense to somebody existing in that mindset and having this information fed to them all the time. And Herman and Chomsky note, by the way, that if there was a different version of this, where an assassin shot a high-ranking Soviet official, of course the U.S. would question the information that it received and all of the sort of groundwork facts that these journalists laid out to get to this conclusion. The U.S. would investigate that very closely, but because it fits with the dominant narrative in the U.S., they can just run with it. And obviously that is exactly what they did. The U.S. government, which, let's be honest, probably had a very good idea that all of this evidence was manufactured in the first place, but the U.S. would just sort of give halfway comments to the press that neither confirmed nor denied, but still helped the story be pushed along. One of the headlines the authors pick out is U.S. intrigued but uncertain on Bulgarian tie, which is a perfect way to do that, right? You're intrigued, but you're uncertain. You have plausible deniability, but listen, if it's true, maybe it's true. And because of this, Sterling and Henze in particular came to absolutely dominate the media coverage. And, remember the Upton Sinclair line. If your job and your livelihood depends on something being true, you're probably not going to see the falsehood. So even though details started to come out about how the Italian secret police did manufacture some information, things like that, little things that should have immediately undermined this entire case, they just kept going with it. And the story itself, Herman and Chomsky say, adapted over time. It changed to suit the moment. This had to be the story, and so facts that came up in the case were just kind of consistently reinterpreted. Then, and this always happens, but these two journalists were kind of elevated. They were elevated by the outlets, especially Reader's Digest, which put a lot of money and time and effort into this, but also by think tanks. Herman and Chomsky mentioned the CSIS, American Enterprise Institute, which also both kind of pushed their views because, again, this is something that's very convenient, and these places, these think tanks and institutes typically have a lot of money behind them, particularly a lot of billionaire money behind them. And meanwhile, the Reagan administration is getting really interested in this story as well, because doesn't this story also suit this sort of Reaganist outlook on the world? Of course it does. So they will go and they will support this narrative kind of as much as possible. The New York Times made Sterling a regular contributor, and they just sort of ascended in the media sphere. And throughout this, at no point, Herman and Chomsky say, does anyone really try to challenge this narrative? So we have things like a letter, a 1979 letter, where Aksha threatened to kill the Pope and outlined his own political inclinations. Remember, before he goes to Bulgaria. So where's the Bulgarian connection? You also have continued evidence of this weird Italian operation in prison that was consistently ignored. Things like that were just sort of left on the table, because if they don't fit the narrative, why go further to confirm or deny them? Just ignore them. When it later came time for the case to go to trial in Rome, Herman and Chomsky say, it was incredibly awkward. There was no real evidence. There was no conviction. In fact, not too long ago in 2010, Aksha was actually released from prison. There was never any serious reconsideration by the media of this story and their role in it. It was just sort of quietly dropped. And even today, as you go to read about the supposed Bulgarian connection, what you'll typically find is that, of course, a lot of it has been discredited, but there are allusions to just the possible links, the potential of a Bulgarian connection, stuff like that. Now, of course, that's nonsense, but it is a very easy way to frame this as well. Now, I think this is quite a short chapter, but also a very powerful one. It's sort of a real perfect application of this super scientific approach that Herman and Chomsky can occasionally have in manufacturing consent, where they take this academic rigor and they really apply it to a situation. And so this sort of clinical approach, I think, is absolutely fascinating. And it's why I do really enjoy this chapter, even if it is quite short and fairly easy to get through. It's a good one to read just as background, and especially for the sort of complete story that manufacturing consent is trying to tell us. So I will mostly wrap up this chapter here, but as I keep saying, this book has a lot to tell us in the present day. And so I was trying to think of sort of rough examples from now where, the media has kind of just run with a story and the government has half-heartedly supported it because it goes along with the narrative, things like that. And one of the things that I kept thinking about was Havana Syndrome. Well, I don't know if you remember Havana Syndrome. This was a big deal back in around 2016, where we started getting these reports of sort of unknown illnesses coming out of Americans at the Cuban embassy in Havana. And from this, we got this idea of Havana Syndrome, which became sort of a media firestorm. It was really, really crazy. Was it some new weapon that the Cubans or the Russians, even worse, the Russians, were using on these poor people in the embassy in Havana? And you get a little bit of a Bulgarian connection vibe here too, because we just sort of declared this thing as Havana Syndrome before any of the results were really in. And of course, subsequent And of course, subsequent medical evaluations of Havana Syndrome found just absolutely nothing conclusive whatsoever, and no indication that there had been any weapon used on these people in the first place. Anyway, that is my brief rant about how the media can really run with something that can demonstrate or fit perfectly into the propaganda model used by the US, especially in conflicts with hostile foreign powers. I will leave this here, but as always, let me know what you think. Either here, message me directly if you're more comfortable, go to social media, all that stuff. I really love to hear this feedback. And if you can think of sort of current examples that scream Bulgarian connection, I would love to hear those as well. Anyway, we will be back next week to talk about the Indochina Wars. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.